Hey, welcome everybody to the Network MindOUT webinar today. My name is Sally Morris. I'm the coordinator of MindOUT with the National LGBTI Health Alliance. Thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar on working with culturally and linguistically diverse people, LGBTI people. Today, we're using a brand new platform, so I'm hoping that everything is going smoothly. And we have a chat box on the lower right-hand side of your screen that you can type any messages and so forth in there. So I'm hoping that actually just at the beginning, I can just do a bit of a sound check and make sure that people can see and hear us okay. So if people just want to write in the text box that you can see and hear us, that would be wonderful, just to give me some reassurance that people are out there. Excellent. Wonderful. Seems like everyone can see and hear us, which is amazing. So before I kick off, we'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're gathering. And when we do our webinars, we are across lots of different countries and lands across Australia. So I'd like to acknowledge all of the owners of all of the different lands on which we're meeting today. Today we have Dr. Judy Tang, who's the president of the Australian GLBTIQ Multicultural Council, AGMC, and she's an advocator and keen educator on issues around equality and barriers for people who identify as multicultural and LGBTIQ. So I'm really excited to have Judy here today talking about this topic, and so I'm going to hand over to her shortly. And I just wanted to just let people know that Judy is more than happy to take questions throughout today's webinar. So please just type in the text box down the bottom any questions you have for Judy throughout today's webinar at any time. And just I'm asking people, I'll come back on at the end, and we're going to be doing an evaluation at the end of today's webinar, and I'll give you a link for that at the end. So I am going to hand over to Judy, and hope all goes well.
Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. As you can see, we're just talking to Sally before that from Melbourne, so it's a bit chilly here. I've got I didn't put in as many slides because I wanted to have a lot more discussion, if possible, with everyone. Because at the end of the day, there really is no secret with regards to working with someone who comes from a different culture or different ethnicity and identifies as LGBTI. At the end of the day, we're all people with different ideas and values and understandings, and it's just up to us to go get to know each other to see what's important for each individual that's out there. So that's something I'd just like to start. But like I said, feel free to ask me anything and just type. I can see the chat box here, and hopefully we can get a discussion going. And if you have any questions, just ask as well, because I want to make sure that you get as much out of this as possible, rather than me assuming and hoping that I'm answering a lot of your questions. So let's go through, see what we have. I know that Dr. Tony Mordini, he's the previous president of AGMC. He's also already done a presentation on working with culturally and linguistically diverse people previously. So I think if you just Google National LGBTI Health Alliance and AGMC, or called CALD, that should come up on YouTube, or I'll see if Sally and myself can find you the link to share later on. Tony's really gone through a lot of the academic aspects and a bit of really deep information with regards to multicultural and LGBTI. Myself, on the other hand, I thought I'd take a more of a personal approach to give you an idea of my background, and I thought the best way to really understand someone and culture sometimes is just to get to know someone. So what I thought I would do is I would share with you my brief backstory, also known as Judy Came Out Twice. So I have a Chinese background. My parents are Chinese, and they were refugees from Vietnam. came over to Australia in 1980 as refugees after the Vietnam War. Okay, sorry, just said my internet was a bit unstable. After the Vietnam War. So coming to Australia, as with a lot of migrants at that time, there was a real need to ensure that we all fit in and that we all played our part in coming to this new country, Australia, that had so wonderfully welcomed us at that time. To the point that some families, to ensure that they assimilated or was able to fit in as much as possible, they actually consciously chose to not teach their children Asian languages. So they wanted them to just learn English because they were afraid of perhaps being bullied if they were to go to school, or doing whatever they can to make sure that they did whatever they could to make sure they were as little different as possible. So that was kind of the background of a lot of our families growing up, is to make sure that we were good Australian citizens and we fit in as much as possible. So keep that in mind. My first coming out was in university, and basically I told my mother, and she burst into tears and then ran off, because I was still living at home at that time. And she's saying, if that's what it is, and she goes off and bursts into tears. So it didn't really go back so well. It didn't go so well. And it, got to the point that she was threatening me to move to Brisbane, because according to her, that was as far as she could move to get away from, people that she knew, friends and family, was to move to Brisbane so that no one would know her. And what happened was, eventually, my father came and had a chat with me and said, I actually don't mind. I don't understand it, but I accept if this is the way that, this is the way that you are, then that's what it is. You're still my daughter at the end. And so I was really thankful that he did say those words to me. He said, however, can you please, because you're still living at home, I was finishing off my doctorate degree at that time, could you potentially go back into the closet, because I have to work every day. I have to get up, in the morning, but every night I haven't been able to sleep because your mother's just been chatting into my ear about how, how Judy is like this and how we may need to consider moving to Brisbane. So for my father's sake, so that he could get a good night's rest and go to work, I went back into the closet. It was as simple as me telling my mother I changed my mind, and she was like, oh, really? And then, but of course, as most parents, they knew, but she was going on with those words anyway for a while. So that was my first coming out. My second coming out was I'd met my partner. That's me around the first time coming out, my graduation undergraduate photo. And that's a photo of me around the second time that I was coming out. Was the City of Melbourne had opened up the registry for couples, and they had opened it up for same-sex couples. I don't know whether any of you remember that. That was a while back. And so for a bit of fun, because I read it was only $50, I convinced my girlfriend to register as a couple there. So we put in all the details. I was still living at home. I was just about to move out. So what we did is we filled in the details with her address and all correspondence to be sent to her address. And sure enough, with Murphy's Law, they sent the registration confirmation to my home address, which was where I was still living at home at that time. And my mother, seeing this letter that had the council logo, thinking that I'd received another parking fine, opened up the letter, and it was the gayest letter, literally, that you could ever come across. It was, welcome to the City of Melbourne. We're here to celebrate your gay relationship, and we're so happy with all these gay things. And that's my dog, by the way. And gay things. So my mother had left that letter on the table on my study, and that was how I came out the second time. The next morning, so the next morning, I had a chat with my mother the next morning, and it was interesting because the first question she said to me was, why did you lie to me? So I had to think relatively quicker. But then I decided to tell her the truth. I said, well, I lied because you look so distraught the first time, and you've raised me to think about family and appreciate that we all sort of working together to make sure everyone's happy. So I didn't want to see you unhappy. So that's how it happened. That's why I didn't tell you the truth. And at that point, she said to me, well, do you like this person? And I said, yes, and she said, if that's the case, then you have my blessing. Yay. So that's my second coming out. But of course, my mother wanted to have the last word. So she said to me, and also, you're going to have to do your own laundry from now on before you move out. So, I said to her, fine, fair deal, I'll do my own laundry. And that's my second coming out. So that's my story. There's a bit that I left out in there, which I want to talk about in the next slide, is whether I had felt any different. So when I first had came out, I was going to university. So the first place, as most university students back then, was to head off to the queer lounge. And I was really, really, really excited. And I'm glad that they have these lounges available for support, because I got to meet a whole bunch of people. And we were a little rainbow family. So that was really nice nice and exciting to meet other people like myself. Although having said that, at that time, the lounge was not as culturally diverse. So I literally was, for a while anyway, the only Asian in the lounge area. And despite, even though we had a lot of similarities, we had in terms of embracing all the different diversities when it comes to sexuality, there was just something missing for me from that lounge, and I couldn't really find out why until perhaps a few years later, and I was just looking back on what it is that it felt like I didn't 100% feel part of that group. And these were the things that I sort of had realized over time. So it was the idea at that time anyway, it was a notion of coming out as a rite of passage. You almost had to come out to prove yourself, to prove your sexuality. And that was not something I was comfortable with at that time. And also within that grouping, and aligned with the whole coming out process is a more of a focus on individualism, in the sense that who cares what your family thinks? Who cares what your parents think? You have to be yourself. That's something that a lot of people from different cultures hear all the time, is the notion to be yourself. And it's frustrating because for them, a strong sense of self is connected with family or their community and so forth. So the idea of just doing it for yourself and screw whatever else is happening doesn't necessarily sit well when you're working or communicating with someone who comes from a culture that values or feels very strongly bonded with family and their community. Social preferences, it was just a little tiny thing that, at that time, going to the pub was not really something that a lot of people from the Asian cultures would necessarily be interested in, whereas it was, perhaps the only social outlet. So in many ways, I may have not participated in as many social gatherings as I would have liked to, because the social preferences were different. And lastly, the notion of cultural understanding. sometimes it can just get a little bit tiring having to explain your culture or your values all the time. And just before this whole thing started, we were talking, I was talking to Sally, and you know, she was saying that I didn't have to explain the LGBTI 101, you know, what is trans, what is bi, and what is gender, and what is sexuality. And so I know a lot of people from the rainbow community do feel and can probably sympathize in the sense of having to always explain and do a quick, you know, LGBTI 101 for people. So it's kind of the same thing when a person from a different culture sometimes just gets a little bit tiring having to do a quick culture 101 for the person. So sometimes a little bit lack of that cultural and understanding can just lead to a bit of social fatigue, so to speak. An example, I guess, for myself personally, from the Asian culture, is to explain filial piety. It's probably one of the most common things that we need to explain, is that sense of care and respect for parents, for our parents who have put in particular effort and care to raise us, and for us to provide that care and concern respectfully. So that's what we have in terms of feeling different. Let's see. So that was around university that was happening for me. Fortunately, at that time, purely out of nowhere, someone came and talked about a group called Yellow Kitties, which is an Asian queer women's group. And although I had friends and felt connected, as I mentioned before, with the people within the Queer Lounge and within the LGBTI community, it was the next level of connection, so to speak, to have found a group such as Yellow Kitties, where it was everything in one. You know, it was people who also came from other Asian cultures, and also identified as LGBTI. So it was very exciting to be able to meet other people and not feel like I was the only Asian gay in the village, so to speak. So that was an exciting time. And, you know, for example, in terms of social preferences, you know, rather than going to pubs, they were perhaps more interested in yum cha or eating dumplings, that, you know, and which was not as yet trendy as it is now that we had. So from there, I joined Yellow Kitties, and within a couple of years, someone had an interesting idea. Someone from the Italians women group thought that there's really no dialogue around multicultural, multifaith, and LGBTI. So this is back in 2004, I'm showing my age, 2004. And so she had this amazing idea to bring all the local groups together. You know, there was Greek and Gay, there was the Jewish groups, the Italian groups, there was Yellow Kitties, there was Gay Asian Proud, and a few other groups. And she pulled us all together, and we had our first conference in 2004. So that was the AGMC conference in 2004. And it was amazing, because it was the first time that I actually got to meet a lot of people from other cultures and get to understand their values and work with them. So it was a huge party every meeting, as far as I could say. Meetings also went for very long, but it was fun to get to know other people in other groups. And after that conference, we wanted to keep that dialogue going. So one of the main things that we focused on was, at that time, racism and prejudice and biases within the LGBTI community. So we formed AGMC, the Australian GLBTIQ Multicultural Council, and it's been going ever since. So just really quickly about AGMC, what we do now is we do a lot of advocacy, research, training, and community work. We act as much as we can as the umbrella organization for all the local social support groups out there. And so if you know of any people who are starting up particular multicultural social support groups and would like a bit of support or resources, then let us know. We're at AGMC. So one of the interesting things about that conference at that time is obviously I mean, there were some people saying, oh, as if there'd be racism or prejudice within the LGBTI community, and not vice versa. And on the other hand, we had a lot of multicultural communities coming back to us, AGMC, and saying it's in the too hard box. You know, we already have to deal with racism, that it's just too much to have to deal with sexuality and gender. So those were the barriers that we had a lot of issues with. So it was hard to get our foot into the door with a lot of multicultural communities because the door was closed. They were not interested in even approaching that topic anyway. And within the LGBTI community, there was perhaps a naivety that racism or prejudice didn't really exist anyway. So what I have here is just some examples of what happened, which just highlights, it's not overt racism, but perhaps it's just a misunderstanding. And later I'll introduce a term called ethnocentrism that highlights that still a lot of work needs to be done. So one example was, as the conference back in 2004 was about to go ahead, was it also who auspiced us at that time, insisted that we had to have a glass of champagne at the conference reception because it's the done thing. This is how you do a conference. It has to be with a glass of champagne, despite every one of our community member from each cultural group saying to them, I think if we spent more money on a food budget, that would go down much more than the drinks budget. But they insisted, and so everyone had a ticket to get a free glass of champagne at the conference. And guess what happened? Sure enough, hardly anyone reimbursed or used their coupon to get that glass of champagne, but the food was gone. So, you know, again, that's one example of a cultural misunderstanding. After our conference, we also had a party, a dance party called United We Dance, and I was it was my shift to be at the door, to be the ticket person. And these two people came up and asked what the party was about. So my friend and I, we explained to them that it's a multicultural dance party to celebrate multiculturalism within LGBTI. And one guy turned to the other to said, nah, no wogs, and then walked out. So that's true story. And these are the behaviors and the expressions that sometimes we're working with. AGMC, we've also put out a lot of panel discussions to really open up the dialogue about culture, ethnicity, faith, and LGBTI. So we've had a few panel discussions around the idea of whether it's a fetish or it's a legit preference, whether it's racist or not, and we called it No Curry, No Rice. So that went down really well. So I hope we can have a lot more panel discussions like that. And so if you're interested, please let us know, because it'll give us the motivation to organize a few more. And lastly, it's just the notion of other microaggressions or erasure, and I like to call these pinpricks, because it's not overt racism, but it's just forgetting that we exist or where we are around. So perhaps if there's less diversity shown in the LGBTI media or in LGBTI resources, that's it. You have that happening enough, and it'll feel like you don't exist. And I'm sure everyone can really empathize and understand that as well. So that's what we have. All right, here we go. So I came across this term and it explains many things for me, is the notion of ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is a term that describes a belief that our own culture, moving my stuff, our own culture and cultural practices are central to the smooth operation of society and hence superior in some way to other cultures. So the notion of ethnocentrism is that it distorts communication between people. So here are some examples. An example could be describing some countries as driving on the wrong side of the road. Why not just say opposite side or left-hand side? Another example was how we could talk about written Hebrew as reading backwards. Why not say from right to left, or in the opposite direction of English? This is very, very important because language and these little subtle pinpricks can really distort communication and a sense of feeling safe and welcome in that discussion. And certainly that's something I'm sure a lot of people within our remote community might experience themselves. So to give you an example, when I was a student in a placement, a pediatric placement that they had at that time, one of the psychiatrists said that this child was at risk of homosexuality. And this was, again, back around 2004, 2005. So wording such as that, I hope you can see that that's pretty crappy wording. So things like saying, oh, that's right, because she was saying it was saying at risk of homosexuality because she was quite young and she was listening to heavy metal music at that time. To me, it's like, what a cool kid. But as you can see, that terminology it gives an idea of ethnocentrism, that it's an issue or it's a risk with regards to our gender and sexuality. And that's exactly the same if you use similar wording with regards to someone's culture. So if there's anything you can take home from today, is to be aware of this notion of ethnocentrism and your own languaging and how that might reflect on your internal assumptions for a particular culture or particular group of people. Are there any questions if people want to type it out with regards to that? If not, I'm going to fly through. Okay, so here's another example of ethnocentrism. Have a look at this ad and tell me what you think.
Dear Mum, I've taken to pen and paper because there's something I want to say. There have been many times lately where I have felt hopeless, where it's felt like everyone is against me. I know how difficult this has been for you, and I know this hasn't always been what you believe, but I know you believe in me. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for giving me hope for the future. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for voting yes.
Authorised by Dr. Judy Tang, Yes Alliance Melbourne.
Okay,
Dear Mum,
let's go to the next one. All right, so the reason why I showed that was because during the equality campaign last year, this ad was made to represent the multicultural, multifaith communities and their support and our support for the yes vote. I hope you all liked the ad. I thought it was quite touching. It gets me every time I watch it. What happened was it didn't make the cut for the equality campaign, and it was all about to go through, but the feedback that we got was some people from a Western background disagreed with that, in the sense that they thought that children should not have to thank their parents for voting yes. It's a right, you should be voting yes. And that's how it didn't get through. That is another example of ethnocentrism that I just talked about before. And it's really frustrating because although we didn't get the media coverage as much as we would like, there was so much hard work going in the background from all the multicultural groups and a lot of multicultural communities to support the yes vote, and that never made it into people's minds that was happening, because we're talking about the pinpricks like the erasure. We weren't represented in media. We weren't given that space to show our support. And as we know, also at the same time, there were, which I think was an issue, that there were ridiculous amounts of funding, I think, that had gone into multicultural communities to promote the no vote. And then we know what happened afterwards. Is after we got the yes vote, there was this huge issue about how some areas in Sydney that had a larger proportion of people from a different culture or faiths voting no. So that was so frustrating to watch and see, because it felt as if no matter what we did, people from different cultures will always be in the wrong. If we're not given the platform, or if we're not given the resources to show our support, then when things go bad, we're highlighted again of all the things that we're done wrong, all the things that's wrong with these culture and these people and this community. So I hope this highlights that these are the barriers and these are the issues that AGMC and also the LGBTI community in a wider sense are having to work to promote real diversity and inclusion in our communities. All right, so the next slide is the notion of intersectionality, and I also would like people to keep in their minds, why aren't we working together more? So, if we're talking about strength in numbers, then it's so important that we combine all the different communities together to build a stronger and more inclusive communities and Australia. So, all the multicultural communities, all the LGBTI communities, all people with disability, women and migrant groups and so forth, we all really should celebrate our differences and celebrate the intersectionality so that we can come together and work with each other to propel each other and ensure that our voices are heard and our opinions do count. So keep that in mind, that, is there something that we can do to ensure that all these different groups can work together? I thought I'd also just provide a quick summary slide from a shorter presentation that I did for the Victorian Roundtable for Multifaith Roundtable. So, I had done a quick ask around from a lot of people who identify as having a faith and LGBTI, and this was the feedback and the message that they wanted to provide to the faith leaders. So people who identify as having a faith in LGBTI want their faith leaders to know these things. Firstly is for them to know their power. Know their power in the sense that they have influence which they should use to improve connections and support within their faiths. So know their power. Secondly, which I thought was quite interesting, for a lot of these people, just discussing faith and sexuality, faith and gender, is okay. That's all they wanted. They just wanted some dialogue to happen, which I suspect in a lot of perhaps in a lot of other churches or faiths that they don't even broach the topic at all. So even some discussion was okay for them. The third point is they felt that all leaders, all their church leaders, should be educated, educated in theology or educated in some respect, because that gives them a deeper understanding, which leads to the next point, an appreciation of historical context with regards to their information and their understanding and their values. The next one is there is continued concern, and this will always be something we'll have to think about and brainstorm on how to work with this, is there's a continued concern for gender-based rituals or ceremonies. We don't have the answers, we don't have an idea, but like I said, just discussing it is the first point to see how that fits in for the people. They were also wanted to make a distinction between LGBTI inclusive versus LGBTI affirmative. So a lot of people are now asking churches whether they are one or the other, whether they are inclusive or whether they're affirmative. If you're not sure, a lot of people who identify as multifaith and LGBTI are looking for an LGBTI affirmative place. And that's where, unlike LGBTI inclusive, where they say their door is open for LGBTI people and communities, but that's it. It kind of just stops there. You can come in, but there won't be necessarily any discussion or any positive regard even towards that person. Whereas an LGBTI affirmative church will not only welcome but also affirm and validate their sexuality and gender, if that makes sense. The next point was don't leave your people behind for fundamentalists. I felt like a lot of them were left behind to be the scapegoat or to be attacked, and they really called on their faith leaders to back them up so that you know, they'll back them up in return. It's pretty straightforward. And two more, which is to connect with your English as a second language, ESL groups. So, for example, there may be a Korean church that is in a lot of ways just by itself and going through its own information and translation of information, which might be correct. So it's actually important for faith leaders to ensure that there's a correct translation of information or correct understanding or communication with regards to what's understood between faiths or within the faith. And lastly is to understand that everyone is at different stages. Some people are probably in, you know, we know this, some people are in the questioning phase. Some people, you know, for them, their sexuality has no impact upon their faith, whereas someone else, there has a huge impact. Everyone's at a different stage with regards to faith and their sexuality and or gender. And for the church or faith leaders to understand that will be a huge help. Great, no questions either? Go on to the next one. Let's see. All right, towards the end here. So I have had a few people say to me, which is always fascinating to me because it's not as if I necessarily understand privilege in some respects, but I do in others, is the notion that people say, I feel guilty of my privilege. So nice and easy.
Hi all. Apologies, we seem to have some technical difficulties at our end with Judy. Hopefully she will reconnect, and then we'll get her to continue her presentation, just as she got to a crucial point there, actually. Okay, so hopefully Judy will reconnect. So in the meantime, I'd just like to invite anyone to think of any questions they might have for Judy, and to type them here in the chat box. While hopefully it won't be too long before she is coming back. Technology. Okay, unmute.
Everything.
Hi, Judy.
I wonder how much. Hey.
Welcome back. We lost you just before. You were just showing the 2 slides, and just about you were saying, and the key point is, so it was like, so just before you were describing the 2 points, when you were describing that people say often they feel guilty of their privilege.
Oh, okay, cool.
And that's where we lost you.
All right. Did I show you the slide? Because the 2 points is literally on the slide.
Yes, the slide.
Okay, good. So first one, please don't. Please, let me just share the slide. All right. Thank you. Give me 1 second. I'll sort myself out. Share screen. MindOUT. Is it working?
Yes. Can you just turn your video back on? I think we've lost your video.
Okay. All right.
Perfect.
Is my video back on?
No, we've still lost your video, but that's like, we can perhaps continue without your video.
Ah, you'll miss out on my beautiful mugshot. All right. Well, we're close to the finishing anyway. So first and foremost is, please don't feel guilty. No one wants you to. Well, I definitely don't want you to feel guilty. And I can safely assume that many people from many different cultures and faiths don't want you to feel guilty. We want you to use it as an ally instead. So using that privilege to call out on behavior that shows ethnocentrism, for example, or using that privilege to encourage people to think about their wording or their languaging, and how that might distort communication. So that's as simple as that. Don't feel guilty. We don't want you to feel guilty. We want you to use your power for good. All right. And lastly, we have a conference coming up. It's going to be in Melbourne, September 21 to 23. You've got an AGMC. Everything multicultural, multifaith, LGBTI will be there. So, and that's the link down the bottom. We've got a few people speaking there, including Benjamin Law. I think Mama Alto hopefully will be performing. I will ensure that is the case. And we've also got the CEO of SBS, so Michael Abide, presenting as well. And also, who else? Stephanie Gunn just confirmed, and she's from NDIA, because we were talking about intersectionality just before. So we will have streams that promote and show our build on intersectionality. We will have a disability stream, for example, and the last day will be youth focused, to ensure that our future generations can really feel they have strong foundations to go on, to ensure we have a very beautiful and diverse rainbow community. And that's all we have. Is there any particular questions that people... I'll try if I can do my thing.
Yeah, so just invite people, if you have any questions for Judy, just type a message in the comment box down the bottom right-hand side. But that was a really amazing presentation. I really appreciated your thoughts and insights and stories. I've got a question from Hamal, wondering what type of activities AGMC do in Brisbane.
Excellent question, Hamal. I was just talking to Sally about that. AGMC, now that I'm president, I have big, hairy, audacious goals. As you might have realized, we're quite Victoria centric. So a majority of us are in Melbourne, and I really want to set up interstate chapters as much as possible to ensure that we can continue to provide our support for multicultural and multi-faith LGBTI in every state. So if you or if you know anyone who's interested in forming that interstate chapter in Brisbane for AGMC, then please, please, please do get in touch. We're not asking for much, or we need someone, we just would like someone to be connected with the to be connected in Brisbane, to keep an ear on the ground, to make sure, and just let us know what we need, how AGMC can be there to support and build up on anything if required. So we have done stuff in Brisbane, but not often. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for asking.
Excellent. Okay. Any other questions for Judy? Hamal says that he will keep in touch with you. So that sounds great.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Nothing. Nothing's jumping out as of yet. So if anyone's else typing questions in the meantime, I'm just going to ask people before you leave today's webinar if you can actually head over to do an evaluation. And I've just put that in the comment box. Sorry, I've just written that to the wrong person. So we just have some details here. So if you head over to menti.com, MENTI, and enter the code 270510, there's a little evaluation survey on today's webinar. So I'd really appreciate any feedback. And there's a question there from Tina. Judy, do you have any speakers already organised for the conference or still accepting submissions?
Nope, we are accepting as many submissions in all different forms. So please check out the conference website and just submit your idea. So we're looking for workshops, presentations, performances, anything really. And I'll be even more excited if you're from a different state, actually, to ensure that it's a truly national conference as opposed to AGMC in Victoria conference.
Excellent. No, that's really quite exciting. Question from Catherine. Curious to know what type of work AGMC is doing around issues that multicultural LGBTI young people face.
Thanks for that. Well, good news and, well, actually no, just bad news really. Bad news is that last time there was a Better Together Equality conference that had a multicultural caucus, and a lot of the youth were there. And the bad/sad thing was they were complaining about the same things that I was complaining about over 10 years ago, which means within the LGBTI space, nothing has changed much from what I've mentioned with regards to my story back then. And within the multicultural space, there actually has been some movement, and that is the good news. And there's been some traction because of the Yes Equality campaign last year, because the whole nation was talking about marriage equality, that a lot of multicultural groups were then drawn into that conversation. It's a conversation that they had to have, and because of that, now a lot more multicultural communities are starting to reach out, or if not reach out, at least have the door slightly ajar for us as AGMC to really barrel through as much as possible. So at this point in time, for example, the Victoria Multicultural Commission are very keen to work with AGMC as closely as possible to ensure that there is you know, that intersectionality is supported. And also FECA, the Federal Ethnic Communities Council of Australia, are also coming on board, and they've sponsored the AGMC conference as well. Tina said, sounds great, but we're a national org, but we're based in Victoria. Do you mean... No worries, Catherine. Do you mean... No, that's a good thing. We can catch up if you want. So any presentations, I think that's the presentation or the conference question. So any presentations or any conferences, ideas, please let us know. We don't want it to be the same old boring conference style. So yeah, just come at us with what you've got.
Excellent. And I just want to interject, I'm really sorry that the Mentimeter code doesn't seem to be working. So I will follow up with the person who set that up, and I will actually email, because I've got a list of registrations, so I'll email everyone who's participated today with the correct code. So I'm sorry about that. We're trying a bit of new technology today. So it'd be great to hear some feedback on how that is all working. So apologies for that. Any other questions for Judy before we finish up today? Okay, that probably appears to be everything. Thank you everyone for participating today, and a huge thank you to Judy for spending your time here today, presenting your story and your knowledge and your wisdom. Really appreciate those really amazing insights. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and please keep connected with Network MindOUT for details on our next webinar, and I will actually email everybody with the correct code for the evaluation for today's webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you.